What if I told you the deadliest weapon in the history of mankind wasn't made of iron or fire, but flesh? Not a sword, not a catapult, not even a spear forged by a blacksmith's hand, but something infinitely quieter and more permanent: a womb. In the 13th century, while most kingdoms were busy sharpening their blades or inventing creative new ways to torture people for blasphemy, one man stood on the endless grasslands of Asia and discovered a far more elegant solution. He realized that the most efficient way to conquer a civilization wasn't to burn its cities or slaughter its armies. It was to rewrite its bloodline. That man was Genghis Khan, and his empire wasn't just built on horseback or soaked in blood. It was sustained by a systematic program of female enslavement, where the bodies of conquered women became living battlefields, the terrain on which an entire genetic war was fought and won. You could call it evolution's darkest joke. 800 years later, geneticists would discover that roughly 1 in every 200 men alive today still carries Genghis Khan's Y chromosome. Proof that his most lasting conquest wasn't geographical, but biological. His empire collapsed centuries ago, but his DNA never left the battlefield. So buckle up, because this isn't the kind of history that wins awards for moral decency. It's a story about love turned into empire, about grief that metastasized into genocide, and about how the most human emotions, jealousy, pride, obsession, can build a machine of domination that still echoes in our genes today. And if that sounds like something your high school history teacher forgot to mention, you might want to subscribe, because by the end of this story, you'll either need a history degree or a therapist fluent in ancestral trauma. Let's get right into it. Number 1. The love that started a genocide. Before he became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the scourge of continents, the man whose name would echo like thunder across Eurasia, he was simply Temüjin, a boy who grew up in hunger, exile, and humiliation. He watched his father die by poison, saw his family cast out into the cold, and spent years surviving on wild roots and whatever small animals he could catch with bare hands. By the time he found love, it must have felt like a divine accident, a fragile flame flickering against a cruel wind. Her name was Börte, and in her, Temüjin found the only semblance of peace his life had ever known. She was intelligent, proud, and resilient, the kind of woman who could match his stubbornness and soothe the violence coiled beneath his ribs. Their bond was not merely affection. It was survival disguised as romance, a shelter in the middle of an unforgiving world. When they finally married, after years of separation, it wasn't just the union of two people. It was the brief illusion that fate had decided to stop tormenting him. Börte's wedding gift to Temüjin was a black sable coat, an object so luxurious it shimmered with unspoken meaning. On the step, such a gift was a declaration of both love and power, a symbol of wealth, alliance, and destiny. What neither of them knew, as they stood beneath the vast Mongolian sky, was that this coat would become the first stone in the foundation of an empire, and the last relic of their innocence. Because not long after their marriage, when the air was still thick with the scent of spring and firewood, Börte was kidnapped in a night raid by the Merkit tribe, old enemies of Temüjin's clan. They stormed the camp like a storm of hoofbeats and fire, dragging her from the tent, her cries swallowed by the dark. Temüjin could do nothing but watch from the chaos, powerless, the woman he loved disappearing into the black horizon. For days, he searched. For months, he plotted. When he finally reclaimed her, with the help of powerful allies, Börte returned broken, silent, and pregnant. The child she bore, named Yochi, may or may not have been his. The doubt became a scar that never healed. To the world, Temüjin became a conqueror, but to himself, he was a man forever chasing the ghost of a woman stolen from him. In that wound, in that bottomless well of humiliation, grief, and emasculation, a new kind of vengeance was born. Temüjin decided that no one would ever again take from him what was his. Not a woman, not a tribe, not a destiny. and in the twisted arithmetic of his rage, he reached a revelation that would change history. If love could be stolen, then so could lineage. It was there, amid smoke and ash, that the seeds of the world's most brutal system of female enslavement began to take root. Number 2. When love became law. Once the initial pain of losing Börte hardened into something colder, Temüjin began to see the world not as a place of chance or mercy, but as a chessboard of dominance and submission. To him, chaos wasn't an accident. It was the natural order of things, and only those ruthless enough to control it deserved to survive. Out of this revelation, he began to forge a new philosophy, one that would fuse personal vengeance with political genius. Temüjin realized that to conquer the body was to conquer the bloodline, and to conquer the bloodline was to conquer the future. Steel and fire could erase a city, but the womb could rewrite a civilization. The men he killed were temporary obstacles. The women he took were the building blocks of eternity. That idea, horrifying, methodical, and disturbingly logical, became the spiritual foundation of his empire. When the Mongol armies swept across the steppe, they didn't just bring terror and death. They brought an ideology. Their victories weren't complete when the enemy surrendered. They were complete when the defeated tribe's women were absorbed into Mongol households, when the children born afterward carried Mongol blood, and when memory itself began to blur between conqueror and conquered. It wasn't just the expansion of territory, it was the annexation of identity. Every time Temüjin won a battle, he ensured that no rival bloodline could recover. His message to the world was simple and merciless. Your men will die, your sons will serve me, and your daughters will bear my grandchildren. This wasn't lust masquerading as conquest. It was conquest masquerading as destiny. The body became a frontier, and women became the terrain of empire. Centuries later, geneticists would look at the Y chromosome of millions of men across Asia and find the same silent echo. Proof that one man's grief had metastasized into the DNA of continents. They call it the Genghis Khan haplotype. But if you strip away the scientific language, it's something far simpler and far more terrifying. The fossilized memory of forced birth written into human code. And that is how heartbreak turned into a hereditary apocalypse. Number 3. The Empire of Obedience. Once Temüjin crowned himself Genghis Khan, universal ruler, the philosophy of domination took on the precision of a bureaucratic machine. Nothing about his system was random anymore. Not the killing, not the looting, and certainly not the taking of women. When the Mongols captured a city, they didn't leave the aftermath to chaos. There were procedures, lists, clerks, people whose job it was to transform violence into order. The artisans were spared and relocated to serve the empire. The soldiers who resisted were executed en masse. And then came the women. They were assembled in fields or courtyards, examined under the impassive eyes of Mongol officials. The most beautiful or high-born among them were reserved for the Khan and his closest commanders. Those of lesser status were distributed among the soldiers, their names, or sometimes just their descriptions, recorded in war logs called ordu, the same term used for administrative divisions of the empire. 1/5 of all human spoils went directly to Genghis himself. That wasn't a poetic exaggeration. The empire literally taxed its conquests in human bodies. Each woman, each child, each life became a number in a system so organized it could almost be mistaken for modern governance if it weren't built entirely on suffering. The Mongols' efficiency turned rape into ritual and ritual into rule. By transforming atrocity into policy, they made it sustainable. The horror wasn't in the violence alone. It was in the paperwork. And perhaps the darkest irony of all was that within Mongol society, adultery was punishable by death. Fidelity was sacred, but only for Mongols themselves. To violate a Mongol woman was treason. To violate a foreign one was strategy. It was a perfect, grotesque duality. Purity at home, annihilation abroad. The empire wasn't just maintained by warriors, it was engineered by clerks, written in ink and sealed with the cries of the conquered. Number 4. The womb as a battlefield. As the Mongol Empire expanded, its philosophy of domination evolved from instinct to institution. Genghis Khan's armies didn't simply sweep through Asia like a storm of death. They reorganized life itself in their wake. Every city conquered became a laboratory for the same chilling experiment: how to destroy a people without leaving behind a corpse. Instead of annihilating all survivors, the Mongols did something far more permanent. They absorbed them. The men were executed or enslaved. The women were forced into Mongol households. Their bodies turned into extensions of imperial will. Over time, the genetic identity of the conquered simply disappeared, replaced by the seed of their conquerors. To Genghis Khan, this was genius in its purest, coldest form. Killing men ended a generation. Controlling women erased a civilization. He understood that memory, like blood, was hereditary. If the next generation carried Mongol blood, then the idea of resistance would die with the last, untainted lineage. It was warfare elevated to a philosophy, a strategy that transformed maternity into machinery. The future itself became a hostage. Contemporary chronicles describe the aftermath of a Mongol conquest as both orderly and horrifying. After a city's fall, survivors were divided into categories: artisans, slaves, soldiers, and women of breeding age. Those women were assessed, sometimes publicly, by officers who judged their health, age, and beauty. The elite ones, especially noble-born, were sent to the Khan's camp or to the harems of high-ranking generals. The rest were distributed among soldiers as a grim reward for loyalty. From these women, countless children were born, half Mongol, half everything else. Each child was living proof that the conquered world had been rewritten at its most intimate level. Historians would later call this phenomenon the Mongol genetic footprint. The Mongols, however, called it something simpler: victory. In one brutal stroke, Genghis Khan had turned the biological function of childbirth into the ultimate political weapon. The battlefield no longer ended where the corpses lay. It continued in the wombs of the survivors. Number 5. The administrative nightmare of desire. You might expect all this to be chaotic, savage hordes taking what they want in drunken frenzy. But that's the thing about Genghis Khan. His evil was never sloppy. It was efficient. In one of history's most grotesque paradoxes, the Mongols brought order to the act of destruction. When a city fell, there were protocols, records, and chains of command. The division of captives followed rules, horrifying rules, but rules nonetheless. Women weren't left to chance. They were sorted, documented, assigned. Scribes wrote down their descriptions: hair color, age, sometimes even notable features. In the capital, at Karakorum, imperial clerks maintained these registries as if they were trade ledgers, recording human suffering in perfect calligraphy. And of course, the empire demanded its share. 1/5 of all captives, human and otherwise, belonged to the Khan. If you were a woman taken by the Mongols, you could literally become a part of Genghis Khan's tax revenue. Some accounts even suggest that the empire's communication network, the Yam system, a chain of relay stations that could carry messages across thousands of miles, was occasionally used to transport women. In other words, the same infrastructure that carried state decrees and diplomatic orders also delivered human beings, ensuring the Khan's personal spoils arrived on time. Efficiency, after all, was sacred. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. A symphony of subjugation, conducted by bureaucrats, and that is what made it so chilling. Because when atrocity becomes organized, when cruelty wears the mask of structure and routine, it no longer looks like madness, it looks like civilization. Number 6. The science of terror. By the time the Mongol war machine reached its full strength, conquest itself had become a kind of social science. Genghis Khan's army didn't just win battles through superior tactics or sheer brutality. It manipulated psychology, spreading fear with surgical precision. The enslavement of women was not a byproduct of war. It was part of the propaganda. Stories of what happened to conquered cities traveled faster than the horses that carried them. Whispers spread through markets and caravans. Entire populations wiped out, noble women distributed like trophies, infants slaughtered, families erased from existence. The Mongols didn't need to besiege every fortress. Many gates opened simply out of terror. In the collective imagination of Eurasia, the Mongols became less an army and more a natural disaster, an unstoppable force of annihilation that devoured everything in its path. And the most haunting part of that image wasn't the sword or the fire. It was the knowledge that surrender wouldn't necessarily save you. A city might survive, but its lineage would not. Even surrender was a gamble. Sometimes the Mongols spared the submissive, sometimes they didn't. The only predictable outcome was that the women would be taken, their bodies absorbed into the Mongol system of reproduction and control. It was both a punishment and a deterrent, an empire sustained by fear so deep it could reproduce itself without ever needing to draw another blade. Temüjin had discovered a weapon that conquered without fighting, the imagination. Fear was his messenger, reputation was his siege engine, and the systematic degradation of women, their conversion from people into policy, became the proof that no force on earth could resist him. He once said, "The greatest joy for a man is to crush his enemies, to drive them before him, to take their possessions, and to lie in the arms of their women." It wasn't a metaphor. It was the mission statement of an empire. Number 7. The law of the bloodline. At the height of his power, Genghis Khan began codifying his empire under a set of laws known as the yasa, a code so strict that even the smallest offense could mean death. The irony is almost unbearable. This was an empire obsessed with internal discipline, honor, and sexual purity among its own. Within Mongol society, adultery was punishable by execution. A Mongol woman was sacred. Her fidelity represented the moral fabric of the tribe. But a foreign woman? She was a resource, her body a spoil of conquest sanctioned by divine authority. The same hand that forbade adultery legalized mass rape. The same code that demanded loyalty among brothers institutionalized the ownership of human beings. The yasa was less a law and more a mirror, reflecting the empire's hypocrisy in crystal clarity. Purity for us, degradation for them. And yet, that internal purity, however warped, gave the Mongols their cohesion. They could commit atrocities abroad precisely because they believed themselves morally intact at home. It's a paradox as old as empire itself. Righteousness breeds cruelty when it's convinced of its own virtue. Under the yasa, everything had its place, even horror. The empire became a perfectly tuned engine where devotion and destruction operated side by side. It wasn't barbarism, it was design. And in that design, every man had his duty, every woman her role, every atrocity its justification. The Mongol state was a body, and Genghis Khan was its heart. Every beat pulsed with both discipline and desire, and every child born from a conquered woman was one more heartbeat in the rhythm of empire. Number 8. The machinery of flesh. As Genghis Khan's empire spread like wildfire across Asia, from the frozen plains of Siberia to the golden deserts of Persia, the machinery behind his conquest grew more sophisticated and infinitely more terrifying. The Mongols weren't content with merely enslaving people, they standardized it. What began as instinct and vengeance soon hardened into a systematic apparatus that treated the human body like a resource to be managed, optimized, and redistributed. Each new city captured followed the same grim choreography. First came the soldiers, swift and merciless, killing any who resisted. Then came the administrators, counting, cataloging, sorting. The conquered were transformed into data points, their existence reduced to statistics in an empire that prized control above all else. For women, the system was almost industrial. They were separated into groups: noble women, commoners, the young, the old, the pregnant, each assigned a fate based on their perceived worth. The most beautiful or high-born were delivered as tribute to the Great Khan. Those with useful skills, weaving, nursing, midwifery, were absorbed into the empire's logistical network. The rest were distributed among the soldiers, parceled out like war bonuses. And at the top of this pyramid of suffering was Genghis Khan himself, a man who had turned grief into government. He didn't just allow the practice, he regulated it. He ensured that no one could claim more spoils than their rank allowed, that no officer could cheat the lower soldiers out of their shares. In the Mongol Empire, even depravity had a budget. But what's perhaps most chilling is how this machine managed to erase individuality. Once a woman was captured, her name ceased to matter. She became part of the empire's reproductive inventory, an anonymous vessel in the grand experiment of genetic domination. Through her body, an enemy tribe's legacy ended, and a new one began. This wasn't chaos, this was the logic of empire refined to its cruelest precision, power replicated through birth. Every child fathered by a Mongol warrior was both inheritance and conquest, a living banner planted in the bloodlines of the defeated. It's one thing to rule by fear. It's another to rule by biology. Genghis Khan had mastered both. Number 9. The Genocide, written in genes. Centuries after the Mongol conquest turned to dust, scientists began to notice something strange in the DNA of modern populations across Eurasia. From the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Eastern Europe, millions of men shared a near-identical Y chromosome. The match was so consistent, so specific, that it could only trace back to one man, and his descendants. That man, of course, was Genghis Khan. Geneticists estimated that around 8% of all men in the region, roughly 16 million living people today, are his direct paternal heirs. Think about that for a second. One man's bloodline has spread across a continent, not through romance or migration, but through violence institutionalized as destiny. It's a legacy that defies comprehension. Entire civilizations were erased not only from the map, but from the gene pool. And in their place grew an invisible empire, one made not of cities or soldiers, but chromosomes. Historians sometimes call this the genetic echo of empire. But the phrase is too polite, too sterile. It disguises the horror behind the statistics because each of those shared genetic markers is a memory, the molecular residue of a woman who never had a choice, a life consumed by the ambitions of a man who believed himself chosen by the heavens. And yet, the most haunting truth of all is this: it worked. Temüjin's ultimate victory wasn't his empire of land, which fractured within generations. It was the empire of flesh, a dominion that outlasted kingdoms, faiths, and centuries. His monument wasn't carved in stone or bronze. It was written in us. If history has a sense of irony, it's this: the greatest conqueror of all time didn't just rule the world, he fathered it. Number 10. The cultural fallout. The Mongol Empire may have collapsed centuries ago, but the social and cultural devastation it left behind continued to echo through generations like the aftermath of a seismic event. Wherever their armies passed, the traditional structure of family, lineage, and identity was shattered beyond repair. Entire dynasties disappeared from history, not because their cities were burned, but because their bloodlines were rewritten. In societies where ancestry defined everything, inheritance, honor, religion, belonging, the Mongols had committed the ultimate act of erasure. They didn't just destroy kingdoms, they unmade them at the genetic level. The results were profound. In the wake of conquest, millions of women were left nameless, their identities absorbed into the endless tide of Mongol expansion. Their children were born into a void, half of one world, half of another, and fully belonging to neither. Those children grew up under the shadow of their father's violence and their mother's silence. To be half Mongol was both privilege and curse. It meant survival, but also stigma. And yet, in a perverse way, this process became the blueprint of a new world. Across Asia, cultural boundaries blurred, languages mixed, bloodlines dissolved. The diversity that defines modern Eurasia, The mingling of East and West, steppe and city, is in part the unholy legacy of the Mongol system of female enslavement. The irony is unbearable. From the ashes of annihilation, new identities were born. From violation came vitality. From conquest came connection. Civilizations merged not through diplomacy or trade, but through domination and trauma. If the Mongols had united the world, they had done so by first breaking it. The cultural consequences were not just demographic, they were psychological. For centuries, the stories of these women were erased or buried under patriotic epics about empire and glory. The conquerors wrote their history in triumph, while the conquered carried theirs in silence. But the silence of victims is not the same as forgetting. It is a form of resistance, the only weapon left to those whose voices were stolen. And somewhere in that silence, the world inherited the uneasy memory of what happens when power decides it owns creation itself. Number 11. The Queen Who Fought Back. For all the terror Genghis Khan unleashed, history's cruelty has a strange symmetry. At the height of his dominion, in the twilight of his life, that same logic of conquest, the idea that women could be turned into weapons or spoils, came back to destroy him. Among his last campaigns was the assault on the western Shia kingdom, a small but defiant realm on the edge of the desert. Its ruler's daughter, known in legend as Princess Gurgen, was said to be a woman of great intelligence and unshakable pride. When her city fell, she was presented to the aging Khan as tribute, yet another jewel in a collection of conquered queens. But Gurgen was no passive captive. On the night she was brought to his tent, surrounded by gold, silk, and the weight of empire, she performed an act that history still whispers about. As Genghis Khan approached her, she took the slender hairpin from her headdress, a symbol of beauty and femininity, and drove it deep into his flesh. Some say she killed him instantly, others that the wound festered and took his life weeks later. What matters is not the accuracy of the tale, but its meaning. For decades, he had turned women into tools of submission, their bodies into vessels of empire. In the end, it was a woman, silent, elegant, unarmed, who turned that weapon back on him. The irony was perfect, poetic, and merciless. The man who believed no fortress could withstand him was undone not by armies, but by the quiet defiance of the very gender he had enslaved. Even in myth, history refuses to let domination have the final word. Number 12. The Death of the Conqueror. When Genghis Khan fell, whether by illness, injury, or the silent rebellion of a single woman's hand, his death was shrouded in secrecy, as meticulously as his empire had been built. No trumpet sounded, no monument was raised. His body was carried back across the steppes under cover of silence, guarded by a procession of loyal soldiers sworn to protect a corpse as fiercely as they once protected a crown. Legend says that everyone who glimpsed the funeral caravan was executed, that every shepherd, traveler, or wild animal crossing its path was killed to preserve the mystery of the great Khan's resting place. 1,000 horses trampled the burial ground to erase the earth's memory, and when the task was done, the men who dug the grave were killed as well. Then, as if to complete the circle of paranoia, those who killed them were also executed. In the end, the man who claimed the world for himself left it utterly alone. No one knows where he lies, no shrine, no tomb, no trace. Only the wind over the grasslands keeps his secret. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The man who built an empire by conquering the bodies and souls of millions ensured that not even the earth could conquer his. He erased his own existence as thoroughly as he erased others. Yet the more you think about it, the more it feels like the perfect ending to his story. For a ruler obsessed with control, death was the one thing he could never dominate, so he turned it into a mystery. And maybe, just maybe, the silence of his grave is the only apology history ever received from him. His empire fractured within a generation. His sons fought over the spoils. His descendants, carrying his blood but not his brilliance, tore the empire apart from within. The conqueror's dream dissolved into the same dust that covered his grave, but his true monument, his genetic empire, remained invisible, expanding quietly across the centuries, unburdened by loyalty or legacy. Every breath of the steppe wind whispers the same paradox: the man is gone, but the blood remains. Number 13. The genetic empire. Centuries later, when scientists in white coats began to decode the human genome, they stumbled upon a ghost, a spectral fingerprint scattered across Asia. From the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, millions of men shared the same Y chromosome sequence, a single strand of heredity that refused to die. They traced it back through generations of fathers and sons, across wars, kingdoms, and migrations, until it pointed to one impossible conclusion: the legacy of a single man who lived in the 13th century. Genghis Khan had, in a very literal sense, outbred history. He had achieved immortality not through spirit or scripture, but through the cold arithmetic of reproduction. The same strategy that turned women into vessels of conquest had ensured his bloodline would outlast empires, religions, and nations. In this way, his empire never ended. It merely became invisible. It seeped into the veins of kings and peasants, soldiers and merchants, fathers and sons, until it was no longer possible to tell conqueror from conquered. His empire no longer existed on maps. It existed in mitochondria, hidden beneath skin tones and surnames, beyond memory and morality. There's something almost godlike about it, and something monstrously human, because every drop of that shared blood carries both the triumph of survival and the shame of how it came to be. History likes to say that the Mongol Empire collapsed in the 14th century. Science tells a different story. It's still here, inside millions of living men, pulsing with the rhythm of a conquest that never really ended. The empire of flesh never fell. It simply evolved. Number 14. The women, who remembered. For centuries after the Mongol storm had passed, after the cities were rebuilt and the ashes cooled, it was the women who carried the memory of what had happened, not in scrolls or chronicles, but in whispers, lullabies, and grief. History tends to remember the names of kings, the battles they fought, and the empires they built. But the women who endured those empires were the ones who preserved what the conquerors tried to erase. In villages rebuilt on bones, mothers would sing their children to sleep with stories of what came before, of fathers who vanished into war, of sisters taken by soldiers, of names that must never be forgotten. They became the librarians of loss, the silent architects of remembrance. And in a way, that was the most subversive act imaginable, because for every generation the Mongols tried to overwrite, there was a woman who whispered the truth back into existence. For every bloodline Genghis sought to erase, a mother kept alive the songs, the languages, the fragments of culture that no sword could kill. Even when forced to raise the children of their conquerors, many of these women defied the empire in secret. They taught their offspring the stories of the defeated, bedtime tales filled with ghosts and warnings, not victories. They kept alive the words and rituals of a world the empire wanted buried. Their rebellion was not one of weapons, but of memory. You could say that while Genghis Khan's empire conquered the body, these women conquered time. It's one of the strangest paradoxes in all of history, that the survivors of this system of female enslavement, those meant to be silent and subjugated, became the invisible authors of everything that came after. Their defiance wasn't loud or glorious, but it endured. The empire of men may have vanished, but the songs of women, the ones whispered by firesides and carried in the bones of generations, outlived it. Number 15. The empire that never died. The Mongol Empire officially ended centuries ago. The banners were burned, the titles forgotten, the steppes swallowed by silence, but the ideology, the cold, efficient logic that turned human beings into resources, survived long after the horsemen were gone. It resurfaced again and again, in different uniforms, under different flags. each time proving that history never really learns. It just rebrands its atrocities. The system of female enslavement that began under the Mongols became a blueprint for every future empire that sought to dominate through reproduction, coercion, or fear. You can see its shadows in the harems of later dynasties, in the forced assimilation programs of colonial powers, even in the modern nightmares of human trafficking and wartime sexual violence. Because Genghis Khan didn't just conquer land, he invented a philosophy of domination that seeped into the DNA of empire itself. His idea was brutally simple. If you control the body, you control the future. And from that idea, the world never fully recovered. When we study his legacy today, we do it with awe and disgust in equal measure. We marvel at his military genius, his logistics, his administrative skill, all while ignoring that those same skills were built upon the systematic violation of millions. The Mongol Empire was a masterpiece of organization, yes, but it was also a machine that ran on blood, fear, and wombs. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. It should. Because history's greatest monsters weren't just warriors. They were bureaucrats of the body, empire builders of flesh and bone. If history teaches us anything, it's that power always finds a way to disguise cruelty as order. The Mongols perfected that illusion, transforming chaos into law, domination into destiny, and enslavement into strategy. But beneath all the grandeur and conquest lies the same eternal truth. No empire, no ruler, no god-king ever truly wins when the price is humanity itself. So the next time someone tells you that Genghis Khan was a great leader, just remember, his empire may have united the world, but it did so by breaking the people in it. And maybe that's the real lesson. Civilization doesn't advance by how much it conquers, but by what it chooses not to destroy. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.